Hey BookTube, it's Carrie. Thanks for joining me. Tonight I wanted to talk about The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector, and this is the last work that was published by Clarice Lispector in 1977, the same year as her death. This is the second Lispector work I've read. I read The Passion According to G.H. earlier this year, and I will say that I do think this one is my favorite of the two. When I finished this book, it was a little bit paralyzing. And what I mean by that is I have attempted to record a video on this like 3 or 4 times, and I haven't been able to get through it. I can't quite get my thoughts together about this book. It's something that I'm still kind of mulling over. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about it. I don't really know how coherent or insightful it will be, but here it is. If you're not familiar with Clarice Lispector, I just want to read a little bit of the author's dedication in this book because I think it will give you kind of an indication of what you're in for. So it says, "It is an unfinished book because it offers no answer. An answer I hope someone somewhere in the world may be able to provide. You, perhaps?" And I think that's classic Lispector. She writes fiction that has kind of a philosophical or existential flavor to it, and she lets the reader in on it. So the reader gets to come kind of behind the curtain, so to speak. The narrator of this book is a gentleman named Rodrigo, and it's pretty clear that Clarice Lispector really is the narrator of this book, but she gives the book this male narrator. And he's writing about this very poor typist named Maccabea, who is from the northeastern region of the country. She is very poor, very uneducated. She's fairly ignorant, but she's also very innocent. Based on her circumstances, she should be miserable, but she really isn't miserable. She is just kind of existing, even though she is in very poor health. She is described as being very ugly, but she has some very uncomplicated pleasures. She likes Coca-Cola, she likes to go see cheap movies, and she wishes she were like Marilyn Monroe, which don't we all? But she's not very good at her job. She lives with a bunch of roommates. She seems to be very alone and just kind of existing. The narrator seems to feel pity for Maccabea. At some points, he seems to feel disgust for her and her circumstances, and at other times, I kind of got the vibe that he envied her, and I almost envied her myself at certain points because of her outlook on life. She seems to notice very small things, and she can take pleasure in things that most people would not take pleasure in. For example, on a visit to the butcher shop, just smelling raw meat could give her the feeling as if she had eaten, and she would walk away satisfied. I think that really speaks to how underfed our character is, and also her poverty-stricken circumstances, but it also speaks to her outlook. One thing that the narrator says on page 16, he says, "To probe oneself is to recognize that one is incomplete." And one thing that Maccabea really doesn't do is probe herself. She really doesn't ask a lot of what the narrator calls these unfortunate questions of who am I, and those existential questions that can bring about unhappiness when one really reflects on them. They're hard, they're difficult. They can evoke anxiety and a negative reaction. The narrator also says that Maccabea shielded herself from death by living below par, by consuming her life sparingly so that it should not come to an abrupt end. And so basically he's commenting on Maccabea's inability to really shape her own destiny or go out and really try to change her circumstance and live life a little bit more boldly, which I think that is a good discussion to have. Is it better to live this kind of quiet, uncomplicated life so that nothing really seems very jarring? Or is it better to go out with a bang, so to speak? And I'll get to the bangs here in a second. At one point in the narration, though, I did feel like our narrator, Rodrigo, envied our character Maccabea, because he says she owed nothing to anyone and no one owed her anything. And Maccabea is actually quoted as saying, "I don't have any worries. I don't need to be successful." So there is a bit of freedom in that, Maccabea doesn't really have these desires. And so if you don't have those desires, you won't really be disappointed. She doesn't really have this desire to be successful. She doesn't even really have this desire to necessarily have a husband. We'll see that even with the relationship that's reflected in this book, it doesn't seem to be very traumatic for her when that doesn't work out. And so she seems fairly unaffected by things that happen to her. At one point, the narrator actually admits one of the faults of having success, and he says that any little success invades me and puts me in full view of everyone. And I think this just speaks to the trade-offs of things like success and wealth. And Maccabea talks about things like sadness being a privilege of the rich. Sadness to her is seen as kind of a luxury because she's extremely poor, and it's not uncommon. She's living with other roommates who are probably in the same, poverty-stricken circumstances, and they don't really have time to be too contemplative or sad or anxious because they have to eke out some sort of existence. Is one necessarily better than the other? I do think our author here is making a bit of social commentary about the poor and the treatment of the poor, because, our narrator looks on with disgust and contempt at certain points just because of the circumstances of our character Maccabea and her physical attributes as well. She is described as being very ugly and sickly looking, and just because someone looks like that and appears to be in desperate circumstances, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are insignificant. I think this is a book about significance. It's a book about life. It's a book about identity and life's mysteries. I don't want to ruin the ending, so I'll stop here. But when you look at this book, I thought this was a list of chapters, but actually this is a list of all of the different titles that the narrator gives to this book. And what I took away from that is essentially it's up to the reader really to determine what title kind of speaks to you, and it's up to you to determine what questions this book is asking, and to try to find those answers, because Clarice Lispector is excellent at getting you to think, but she's not going to give you the answers. The narrator uses these series of bangs throughout the book. They're kind of like these little explosions that happen mid-narration, and the way I kind of interpreted them is this is destiny approaching. And I don't want to tell you what happens because I don't want to ruin this book, but we see that Maccabea just kind of lets things happen to her, and as these bangs get more frequent, we know that something's about to happen. And when I finished the book, with the ending, I went back and realized there was something really significant with these bangs, and so I started looking at those. So that was an interesting and kind of mysterious element to the book as well. I really enjoyed this book. Opens up a lot of discussion about poverty and life, and what constitutes a worthy existence. And it really left me almost speechless. So I tried to do a fairly decent job with this video. I hope it came out somewhat coherent, but I think it's worth a read. And if you've read this book and you have any thoughts on it, please give me a comment below. I would just be curious to see what you took away from it. So thanks guys, and have a great night. I'll see you in the next one.